It sounds like the Lord needs to raise up some 49ers fans around here. That was pitiful. Hey everyone, it's great to see you. I'm so glad that we can be together. It's especially good for us all to be together here in this place. Last Sunday's launch of Made for This was everything we hoped and prayed it would be. So thanks for being a part of it, and thanks for being back today to be a part of week 2. Every student of science recognizes the name Isaac Newton. We've all heard the story of Newton seeing or being struck by a falling apple. Now, it's tough to know if a Red Delicious or a Honeycrisp actually thumped Newton on the head, but a friend of his claims that a falling apple inspired his study of the laws of gravity, which made Isaac Newton famous. But what many people do not know is that a man named Edmund Halley was largely responsible for Newton's fame. Without him, we wouldn't even know Isaac Newton. It was Halley who challenged Newton to explore his notions on the force of gravity. It was Halley who corrected some of Newton's mathematical errors. It was Halley who created geometric designs to illustrate Newton's discoveries. It was Halley who convinced Newton to write his famous book, and it was Halley who paid for that book to be published. Yet the only thing we remember Edmund Halley by is a comet that comes by our planet every 75 years or so. And we often mispronounce his name when we refer to Halley's, not Halley's, comet. It's no wonder that historians refer to Edmund Halley as one of the most selfless scientists ever, because he elevated Isaac Newton with no regard for himself or his own fame. We are not big on celebrity speakers here at our church, but we have hosted a few nationally known speakers over the years. If you've been at Westside for a long time, you might recall that NBA basketball star Jerry Lucas spoke here a number of years ago. Inspirational author Bob Goff spoke for us once. Baseball legend Darryl Strawberry preached for us a few years ago. Well, I introduced all of those speakers when they were with us, and I would like to see the hands of everyone who recalls what I said when I introduced them. No one. Well, neither do I, because the one who introduces should never upstage the one who is introduced, right? And that's how John the Baptist felt about his role in God's kingdom. The job description of John the Baptist was to introduce and to elevate Jesus. As one Old Testament prophet said it, John came to prepare the way for the Messiah. He told the people to get ready. He challenged people to clean up their lives and to consecrate themselves to God. And in John chapter 3, a transition is taking place. Jesus is gaining followers, but John the Baptist is losing followers. And for a while, John had been the most visible, famous person on earth. But that chapter was ending. Jesus was upstaging him, and John was good with it. And friend, that is rare. When a person's season of influence comes to an end, you learn something about that person's motives and character. When an athlete ages out, you see whether or not he or she can give up the spotlight humbly. When an entertainer loses his or her best stuff, you see whether or not the person can graciously accept less visibility. When a politician completes his or her term of office, you learn whether or not the term public servant was earnest or empty. When a church leader steps into retirement, you discover if it was all for God or if there were other motives. When the crowds coming to hear John the Baptist began to thin, his followers tempted him to compete with Jesus. Look at John 3, verse 25. A debate broke out between John's disciples and a certain Jew over ceremonial cleansing. So John's disciples came to him and said, "Rabbi, the man you met on the other side of the Jordan River, the one you identified as the Messiah, he is also baptizing people, and everybody is going to him instead of coming to us." The person John had been commissioned to introduce was now on the stage. So John's influence is beginning to wane. His popularity is being replaced by coming obscurity. Would he respond like Edmund Halley, who selflessly elevated Isaac Newton, or would he resent being replaced? Well, look at verses 27 to 30 of John chapter 3. John replied to his followers, "No one can receive anything unless God gives it from heaven. You yourselves know how plainly I told you, I am not the Messiah. I am only here to prepare the way for him. It is the bridegroom who marries the bride, and the bridegroom's friend is simply glad to stand with him and hear his vows. Therefore, I am filled with joy at his success. He must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less." I love that John could say that Jesus' success, Jesus' popularity with the people, Jesus' growing influence brought him joy, even if it meant that John was less visible and less of a key player. Friend, the title of this series is Made for This. And what you and I have been made to do is this. We are made to exalt God over ourselves. When we try to exalt ourselves, it ends up always going wrong. When we exalt God, he decides how much we should or should not be exalted. And God wants us to practice this on each other. Jesus spoke of this often. He taught that we should take the lesser seat, not the seat of honor at the gathering. He taught that we are made to serve and not to be served. We are made for this, to welcome obscurity like John the Baptist did, not to crave prominence and visibility like so many people do. Many of the Christian books for sale, half the sermons on YouTube, are telling us that greatness means being healthy and wealthy and dominant. But Jesus taught that the man who said, he must become more and I must become less, is the greatest person ever born of a woman. If you follow me on social media, you know I recently watched a documentary about the making of the 1985 charity song, We Are the World. Some of you are going to be hearing it in your head all day just because I said the title. Several dozen celebrity musicians worked all night long to record that song. It raised more than $80 million for famine relief. No one was paid, and they had only one night to get it done following an award ceremony for which all of them had gathered. Producer Quincy Jones posted a sign over the entrance to the studio that read, "Check your ego at the door." And many of them did. There were tense moments, there was a little bit of posturing, but most of them sang with the group without being given a solo. These are music stars. Bob Dylan struggled to sing his part of the song, but he humbly asked for help from Stevie Wonder, which was gladly given. When we are willing to become less, God can use us more and more. I want to contrast John the Baptist's willingness to do this with a person in the Old Testament book of Daniel. In that book, we learn that a pagan nation named Babylon had become a very powerful empire. And that dominance had produced a lot of pride, especially in the king of Babylon, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. If there has ever been a leader whose word was the law, it was Nebuchadnezzar. He was not determined to become less and less. He was determined to become more and more. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be the greatest being on earth. And Nebuchadnezzar eventually declared himself to be God, and he built a massive statue in honor of himself. And then he summoned the leaders from throughout his empire, and he gave them a command: you bow down to the statue that represents me, or you die. And for most of them, that was an easy choice. They would go along to get along and save their lives. But for the Hebrews, the God worshipers among the king's advisors, his order was a massive problem. The first of the 10 commandments requires that they worship no other gods. And the second commandment forbade idols and images. And Nebuchadnezzar was asking them to violate both of those with his command that they worship his statue. And there was no fine print on those first two commandments that read, except, of course, if your life is on the line. Nebuchadnezzar's advisors informed him that some of these Hebrews working among them were refusing to bow down to the king's statue, and that infuriated the king. So in his pride, in his anger, he had 3 Hebrews named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into a furnace. Now, in some instances, God allows people to die for their faith. But in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God dramatically saved them. And when it was all over, even King Nebuchadnezzar was praising God for the miracle. Nebuchadnezzar reversed himself, and he made it illegal to speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But King Nebuchadnezzar's faith was shallow and inconsistent, and somewhere along the line it fizzled. So in verse 4 of Daniel chapter 4, we learn that God is once again confronting this king's pride. The king himself writes, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity, but one night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. So I issued an order calling all the wise men of Babylon so they could tell me what my dream meant. Well, one of these advisors of Nebuchadnezzar was Daniel, a faithful Hebrew servant of God, the person after whom this Old Testament book is named. So Daniel listens closely as the king shares the details of this dream. In his dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a massive tree that was visible to the entire world. The tree was loaded with fruit and was home to many birds. Wild animals found shade and nourishment under the tree. But in the king's dream, an angel came down from heaven and ordered that the tree be cut down, its branches cut off, leaving only the roots and the stump. And there was a warning that someone would be cursed with the mind of an animal and be exposed to the elements for a period of time. So the king shares all of this, and Daniel listens closely. And when he finishes describing his dream, Daniel is so shaken by it he couldn't speak, because he realized this dream is bad news for Nebuchadnezzar. But the king urged Daniel to interpret the dream for him, and so he did. The tree in the dream is Nebuchadnezzar. Because of his arrogance, God was taking away his kingdom, cutting down the tree, and the king would be driven into the wilderness to live like an animal. He lived in a palace at that point. He would live in the wilderness soon. It was bad news for Nebuchadnezzar. But the good news was that the punishment was not God's final word. In the middle of verse 25 of Daniel 4, Daniel explains, 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and the roots of the tree were left in the ground, and this means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. Have you learned that heaven rules? Have you learned that the God of heaven is the one who deserves the credit and the glory and the honor for all of the good things in your life? And that in one way or another, he has allowed every good thing that has happened in your life? You know, I can't help but marvel at God's grace when I read the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. For God to give someone like Nebuchadnezzar a chance to repent, someone who declared himself to be God, who required people to worship him, that is a level of grace. That is a level of forgiveness that's almost beyond imagination. And friend, if you have repeatedly ignored God's invitation, if you have repeatedly ignored God's commands or his warnings, I hope this part of the message feels very personal for you, because it means that God is still inviting you to change your posture, your attitude toward him. If you are hearing me, if something in you wants to respond to God, it means that you can, and it means that God is inviting you to do it. Nebuchadnezzar, however, did not do that, at least not at first. Verse 28 of Daniel 4 reads, all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the palace in Babylon. As he looked out across the city, he said, look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. You see any consistent themes there in his statement? It was all about him, wasn't it? Nebuchadnezzar was not willing to decrease. He was all about increasing his stature, his power, his fame. Nebuchadnezzar needed a mom like actor Denzel Washington's mom. After Denzel's career began to take off, he went home to visit, and he apparently seemed a little full of himself to his mom, and he failed to give credit to the people who had helped him succeed in his acting career. His mother did not approve of this oversight or the attitude behind it, so she said, oh, you did it all by yourself, did you? I'll tell you what you can do by yourself. Head outside and get a mop and a bucket and clean these windows by yourself. You can do that by yourself, superstar. And he did. Now, in the movies, Denzel is the equalizer. In real life, it's his mom. Well, God reminded Nebuchadnezzar that he, God, is the equalizer. He appoints rulers. He gives them success. But whom does Nebuchadnezzar thank for the vastness of his empire, the beauty of his capital city? He thanks himself. What about you? Are you in the habit, or maybe you have been taught by our culture, that you're supposed to congratulate yourself and thank yourself and credit yourself for any good thing that happens to you? That is not the spirit of John the Baptist, who said, I must be less and less. He must be more and more. I think the creation can frequently remind us of this principle if we'll allow it to. President Teddy Roosevelt loved the outdoors, so it's no surprise that when he hosted world leaders and diplomats at the White House, he often closed the evening by inviting them to walk outside. And after some conversation, Roosevelt would begin to look up at the sky, and he would stop talking. And after a few awkward moments of silence, his guests would always get the idea and begin to look up at the sky with him. And after several minutes of silently gazing at the heavens, Roosevelt would say, I believe we're all small enough now. Let's get some rest. King Nebuchadnezzar would not admit how small he was without God. And that's why verse 31 says, while these words, those self-congratulating words that he spoke on the terrace of his palace, while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You know, we often remind each other that God's promises are valid, and we should, because there are so many promises that we forget, and there's so much hope that we can have that we just leave on the table. But we also need to remember that God's warnings are valid also. And we sometimes like to pretend that God's promises are valid, but that God's warnings are not. Proverbs 30, verse 5 says, every word of God proves true. Sooner or later, even if you ignore what God says about something or about everything, sooner or later, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, because every word of God proves true. The hopeful words, they're all true. The generous words are true. The stern words and the words of warning, they are true also. If you're like me, there are some words in the Bible that you love to remember because they are such a comfort, but you and I would be wise to meditate on the words that are not so comfortable for us, the ones that confront how we think or how we speak or how we behave. All of God's words are true. I'd like to use the rest of today's message to highlight some tendencies that you and I could have that suggests that we are striving to be more and more like Nebuchadnezzar rather than being willing to become less and less in the same sense that John the Baptist did. I think one of those is insisting on credit. Do you like to get credit for the things you do? Most of us do. I don't know about you, but it's tough for me to be humble when I sense that someone is overlooking my contribution or giving credit for something I did to someone else. And I've sometimes caught myself making sure that people know that I've contributed. And that is trying to become more and more rather than less and less. When we have to have the credit, then we are not walking in the spirit of John the Baptist. We're walking in the spirit of King Nebuchadnezzar. And we have to remember that God is the source of anything that we have offered. So think about it. When have you and I solved a problem without using the mind that God gave us and the education to which God gave us access? When have we earned $1 outside of an opportunity that God gave us? When have we contributed money, something for which we like credit sometimes? When have we contributed money that God did not first provide for us? When have we voiced an insight or answered a correct question or answered a correct answer with a question on Jeopardy? That's the way I should say it, right? When have we forgiven a wrong that was greater than the wrongs we have committed? No wonder James wrote, "Every good and perfect gift is from above." That's so hard to remember sometimes because we are so anxious to credit ourselves. You and I have never acquired anything good. We've never had a moment of enjoyment. We've never done anything noble. We've never said anything right that did not originate with God. Another tendency that suggests that we're trying to become more rather than being willing to become less is when we use religious lingo. Now, this is a tough one because there are some legitimate spiritual words that you and I should know and utilize and speak, but spiritual words also come with a temptation because it is possible for us to employ spiritual words so that people will look at us and be impressed with us. The Apostle Paul said he and his co-workers pledged that they would never use spiritual words deceptively or to get credit for themselves or in some selfish way. And that is a good commitment for you and for me to make when it comes to our words. A third way that we can seek to become more is through self-justification. Rather than admitting when we're wrong, we justify ourselves. Our impulse is to justify many of the things that we do that are wrong rather than to confess them. And when we do, that is a sign that we are seeking applause. We're unwilling to humble ourselves enough to say, I was wrong, I sinned, I shouldn't have done that. When a religious scholar asked Jesus what he needed to do to be saved, Jesus looked into his heart and Jesus challenged him to act on what he already knew, to love his neighbors. But rather than saying, that is something I need to more consistently do, look what Luke 10:29 says of the man. He wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus says, hey, love your neighbor. And that was convicting to him. So he began to think, and he very quickly thought, hey, if I can push someone out of the category of my neighbor, then I'm not obligated to love that person. And so he asked, so who is my neighbor? And when we try to justify ourselves through technicalities, I didn't really disobey that instruction from God. You see, there's a technicality, there's a loophole. When we do that, it is evidence that we lack humility, that we want to be more instead of wanting to be less. Another signal that we are aspiring to be more rather than less is when we harshly judge other people. Why do we have this tendency to be so hard on other people? One of Jesus' most memorable teachings was about two men who were at the temple praying at the same time. One of them was a religious leader, and the other was a tax collector. One of them had the right position in the world, but the other had the right posture toward God. The religious leader thanked God that he wasn't a thief, that he wasn't an adulterer, that he wasn't a tax collector, probably referring to the man nearby. But at the same moment, the tax collector was humbly praying, God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. There is such a difference, and such an important difference, between trying to condemn other people all the time with our words and our thoughts, and consistently coming before God to say, God, I need your mercy because I'm a sinner. Jesus said only one of those men went home justified in God's eyes, and it wasn't the one who was trying to justify himself. That is a deadly habit and tendency in you and me, and we need to recognize it. There's a more subtle form of pride, and I'll just call it self-loathing. And this sounds like the opposite of pride, but demeaning ourselves and comparing ourselves unfavorably to other people and doing this out loud, it's often an insincere performance, because sometimes what we're really doing is we're trying to attract compliments from people who feel sorry for us. It sounds strange, but chronic insecurity is actually an inverted form of pride. Romans 8:31 and 34 reminds us, if God is for us, who can ever be against us? If he did not spare even his own son, but gave him up for us all, won't he also give us everything else? Who then will condemn us? No one. What the Bible is teaching us is that our worth comes from God creating us and loving us and recreating us in Jesus Christ. That's where our value comes from. So we don't have to try to draw words of value out of other people. Friend, has there been a comment or a situation in your life recently? Have you done something? Have you said something? Have you posted something that reveals that you desire to be more and more rather than less and less? And did it register with you? Did you take it to heart? Chan Gailey was in his second year as head coach of Troy State in Alabama, a team that was just a few days from winning the Division II national championship. And as he walked out of his office toward the practice field, his assistant told him that he had a phone call. And without even making eye contact with her, he asked her to take a message. But when she said, "Coach, it's Sports Illustrated," Gailey stopped in his tracks. Now, even though Sports Illustrated seems to be approaching its demise in our day, nothing was bigger than being featured in SI at that time. So Gailey walked back to his office, closed his door, took a deep breath, wanted to sound composed when he picked up the phone and began the conversation. Gailey later confessed that during those few seconds before he picked up the phone, his imagination ran wild with what might be said to him in that call. He wondered if the Sports Illustrated article on him and his team would be multiple pages. He wondered what photos they would use and how big they would be. When he pressed the button on the phone and said hello, the person on the other end of the call said, "Is this Chan Gailey?" "This is Coach Gailey," he replied. The voice said, "Sir, your Sports Illustrated subscription is about to lapse. So can I tell you about our special renewal offer?" I suspect Jesus was thinking about John the Baptist when he said this in Matthew 23, "The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled," Nebuchadnezzar, right? "And whoever humbles himself will be exalted." John the Baptist, whom Jesus said was the greatest person ever. Jesus could have said it like this: "The least among you will strive to become more and more at the expense of others at my expense and ultimately at your own expense. Unlike John the Baptist, who had the beautiful desire to become less and less so that I could become more and more. Friend, do you realize that God doesn't need you to be famous? Do you realize that God doesn't need you to be rich? Do you realize that God doesn't need you to be beautiful? Do you realize that God doesn't need you to know all the answers? If you will become less and less, if I will become less and less, then Jesus can use that to become more and more.